must have been telling lies about Joseph K. For without having done anything wrong, he was arrested one fine morning. His landlady's cook, who always brought him his breakfast at 8 o'clock, failed to appear on this occasion. That had never happened before. Kay waited for a little while longer, watching from his pillow the old lady opposite, who seemed to be peering at him with a curiosity unusual even for her. But then, feeling both put out and hungry, he rang the bell. At once there was a knock at the door, and a man entered whom he had never seen before in the house. He was slim and yet well knit. He wore a closely fitting black suit, furnished with all sorts of pleats, pockets, buckles, and buttons, as well as a belt, like a tourist outfit, and in consequence looked eminently practical, though one could not quite tell what actual purpose it served. "Who are you?" asked he, half raising himself in bed. But the man ignored the question, as though his appearance needed no explanation, and merely said, "Did you ring?" "Anna is to bring me my breakfast," said Kay, and then studied the fellow, silently and carefully, trying to make out who he could be. The man did not submit to this scrutiny for very long, but turned to the door and opened it slightly so as to report to someone who was evidently standing just behind it. "He says Anna is to bring him his breakfast." A short guffaw from the next room came in answer, and it rather sounded as if several people had joined in, although the strange man could not have learned anything from it that he did not know already. He now said to Kay, as if passing on a statement, "It can't be done." "This is news indeed," cried Kay, springing out of bed and quickly pulling on his trousers. "I must see what people these are next door, and how Frau Grubach can account to me for such behavior." It occurred to him at once that he should not have said this aloud, and that by doing so he had held in a way admitted the stranger's right to superintend his actions. Still, that did not seem important to him at the moment. The stranger, however, took his words in some such a sense, for he asked, "Hadn't you better stay here?" "I shall neither stay here nor let you address me until you have introduced yourself." "I meant well enough," said the stranger, and then, of his own accord, threw the door open. In the next room, which Kay entered more slowly than he had intended, everything looked at first glance almost as it had the evening before. It was Frau Grubach's living room. Perhaps among all the furniture, rugs, china, and photographs with which it was crammed, there was a little more free space than usual, yet one did not perceive that at first, especially as the main change consisted in the presence of a man who was sitting at the open window, reading a book, from which he now glanced up. "You should have stayed in your room. Didn't Franz tell you that?" "Yes, but what are you doing here?" asked Kay, looking from his new acquaintance to the man called Franz, who was still standing by the door, and then back again. Through the open door he had another glimpse of the old woman, who with truly senile case is settled or not, and you never know how long these cases will last, especially these days. Of course, you would get the money out of the depot in the long run, but in the first place, the prices they pay, you are always wretched, for they sell your things to the best briber, not the best bidder. And anyhow, it's well known that money dwindles. A lot of it passes from hand to hand, from one year to another. Kay paid hardly any attention to this advice. Any right to dispose of his own things, which he might possess, he did not prize very highly. Far more important to him was the necessity to understand his situation clearly. But with these people beside him, he could not even think. The belly of the second water, for they could only be waters, kept butting against him in an almost friendly way. Yet, if he looked up, he caught sight of a face which did not in the least suit that fat body, a dry, bony face, with a great nose, twisted to one side, which seemed to be consulting over his head with the other warder. Who could these men be? What were they talking about? What authority could they represent? Kay lived in a country with a legal constitution. There was universal peace. All the laws were in force. Who dared seize him in his own dwelling? He had always been inclined to take things easily, to believe in the worst only when the worst happened, to take no care for the morrow, even when the outlook was threatening. But that struck him as not being the right policy here. One could certainly regard the whole thing as a joke, a rude joke, which his colleagues in the bank had concocted for some unknown reason, perhaps because this was his 13th birthday. That was, of course, possible. Perhaps he had only to laugh knowingly in these men's faces, and they would laugh with him. Perhaps they were merely porters. Perhaps because this was his 30th birthday. That was, of course, possible, perhaps. He had only to laugh knowingly in these men's faces, and they would laugh with him. Perhaps they were merely porters from the street corner. They looked very like it. Nevertheless, his very first glance at the man Franz had decided him, for the time being, not to give away any advantage. Then She isn't allowed to, said the tall warder, since you're under arrest. But how can I be under arrest, and particularly in such a ridiculous fashion? How now? You're beginning it all over again, said the warder, dipping a slice of bread and butter into the honey pot. So now you're beginning it all over again, said the warder, dipping a slice of bread and butter into the honey pot. We don't answer such questions. You'll have to answer them, said Kay. Here are my papers. Now show me yours, and first of all, your warrant for arresting me. Oh, good Lord, said the warder. If you would only realize your position, and if you wouldn't insist on uselessly annoying us two, who probably mean better by you and stand closer to you than any other people in the world. That's so. You can believe that, said Franz, not raising to his lips the coffee cup he held in his hand, but instead giving Kay a long, apparently significant yet incomprehensible look. Without wishing it, Kay found himself decoyed into an exchange of speaking looks with Franz. Nonetheless, he tapped his papers and repeated, Here are my identification papers. What are your papers? To us, cried the tall warder. You're behaving worse than a child. What are you after? Do you think you'll bring this fine case of yours to a speedier end by wrangling with us, your warders, over papers and warrants? We're humble subordinates who can scarcely find our way through a legal document and have nothing to do with your case except to stand guard over you for 10 hours a day and draw our pay for that. That's all we are, but we're quite capable of grasping the fact that the high authorities we serve, before they would order such an arrest as this, must be quite well informed about the reasons for the arrest and the person of the prisoner. There can be no mistake about that. Our officials Gerstner's photographs, which were stuck into a mat hanging on the wall. A white blouse dangled from the latch of the open window. In the window, over the way, the two old creatures were again stationed, but they had enlarged their party, for behind them, towering head and shoulders above them, stood a man with a shirt open at the neck and a reddish pointed beard, which he kept pinching and twisting with his fingers. "Joseph K.?" asked the inspector, perhaps merely to draw Kay's roving glance upon himself. Kay nodded. "You are presumably very much surprised at the events of this morning?" asked the inspector, with both hands rearranging the few things that lay on the night table: a candle and a matchbox, a book and a pincushion, as if they were objects which he required for his interrogation. "Certainly," said Kay, and he was filled with pleasure at having encountered a sensible man at last, with whom he could discuss the matter. "Certainly I am surprised, but I am by no means very much surprised." "Not very much surprised?" asked the inspector, setting the candle in the middle of the table and then grouping the other things around it. "Perhaps you misunderstand me, Kay. Hasten to add, I mean, here, Kay." Stopped and looked round him for a chair. I suppose I may sit down?" he asked. "It's not usual," answered the inspector. "I mean," said Kay, without further parley, "that I am very much surprised, of course, but when one has lived for 30 years in this world and had to fight one's way through it, as I have had to do, one becomes hardened to surprises and doesn't take them too seriously, particularly the one this morning." "Why particularly the one this morning?" "I won't say that I regard the whole thing as a joke, for the preparations that have been made seem to elaborate for that. The whole staff of the boarding house would have to be involved, as well as all you people, and that would be past a joke. So I don't say that it's a joke." "Quite right," said the inspector, looking to see how many matches there were in the matchbox. "But, on the other hand," Kay went on, turning to everybody there, he wanted to bring in the 3 young men standing beside the photographs as well. "On the other hand, it can't be an affair of any great importance either. I argue this from the fact that, though I am accused of something, I cannot recall the slightest offense that might be charged against me. But that even is of minor importance. The real question is, who accuses me? What authority is conducting these proceedings? Are you officers of the law? None of you has a uniform unless your suit," here he turned to Franz, "is to be considered a uniform, but it's more like a tourist outfit. I demand a clear answer to these questions, and I feel sure that after an explanation we shall cuffs, fingered his shirt front, ruffled his hair, and as he passed, the three young men said, "This is sheer nonsense," whereupon they turned toward him and regarded him sympathetically but gravely. At last he came to a stand before the inspector's table. "Hesterer, the lawyer, is a personal friend of mine," he said. "May I telephone to him?" "Certainly," replied the inspector, "but I don't see what sense there would be in that unless you have some private business of your own to consult him about." "What sense would there be in that?" cried Kay, more in amazement than exasperation. "What kind of man are you, then? You ask me to be sensible, and you carry on in the most senseless way imaginable yourself. It's enough to sicken the dogs. People first fall upon me in my own house, and then lounge about the room and put me through my paces for your benefit. What sense would there be in telephoning to a lawyer when I'm supposed to be under arrest?" "All right, I won't telephone, but do telephone if you want to," replied the inspector, waving an arm toward the entrance hall where the telephone was. "Please do telephone." "No, I don't want to now," said Kay, going over to the window. Across the street, the party of three was still on the watch, and their enjoyment of the spectacle received its first slight check when Kay appeared at the window. The two old people moved as if to get up, but the man at the back pacified them. "Here's a fine crowd of spectators," cried Kay in a loud voice to the inspector, pointing at them with his finger. "Go away," he shouted across. The three of them immediately retreated a few steps. The two ancients actually took cover behind the younger man, who shielded them with his massive body, and to judge from the movements of his lips, was saying something which, owing to the distance, could not be distinguished. Yet they did not remove themselves altogether, but seemed to be waiting for the chance to return to the window again, unobserved. "Officious, inconsiderate wretches," said Kay, as he turned back to the room again. The inspector was possibly of the same mind. Kay fancied, as far as he could tell from a hasty side glance. But it was equally possible that the inspector had not even been listening, for he had pressed one hand firmly on the table and seemed to be comparing the length of his fingers. The two warders sat on a chest draped with an embroidered cloth, rubbing their knees. The three young men were looking aimlessly round them, with their hands on their hips. It was as quiet as in some deserted office. "Come, gentlemen," cried Kay. It seemed to him for the moment as if he were responsible for all of them. "From the look of you, this affair of mine seems to be settled. In my opinion, the best thing now would be to bother no more about the justice or injustice of your behavior, and settle the matter amicably by shaking hands on it. If you are of the same opinion, why then—" and he stepped over to the inspector's table and held out his hand. The inspector raised his eyes, bit his lips, and looked at Kay's hand, stretched out to him. Kay still believed he was going to close with the offer, but instead he got up, seized a hard round hat lying on Fräulein Bürstner's bed, and with both hands put it carefully on his head, as if he were trying it on for the first time. "How simple it all seems to you," he said to Kay, as he did so. "You think we should settle the matter amicably, do you? No, that really can't be done. On the other hand, I don't mean I thought I was under arrest. Kay asked the question with a certain defiance, for though his offer to shake hands had been ignored, he felt more and more independent of all these people, especially now that the inspector had risen to his feet. He was playing with them. He considered the idea of running after them to the front door as they left and challenging them to take him prisoner. So he said again, "How can I go to the bank if I am under arrest?" "Ah, I see," said the inspector, who had already reached the door. "You have misunderstood me. You are under arrest, certainly, but that need not hinder you from going about your business, nor will you be prevented from leading your ordinary life. Then being arrested isn't so very bad," said Kay, going up to the inspector. "I never suggested that it was," said the inspector. "But in that case, it would seem there was no particular necessity to tell me about it," said Kay, moving still closer. The others had drawn near too. They were all gathered now in a little space beside the door. "It was my duty," said the inspector. "A stupid duty," said Kay, inflexibly. "That may be," replied the inspector, "but we needn't waste our time with such arguments. I was assuming that you would want to go to the bank. As you are such a quibbler over words, let me add that I am not forcing you to go to the bank. I was merely assuming that you would want to go, and to facilitate that, and render your arrival at the bank as unobtrusive as possible, I have detained these three gentlemen here, who are colleagues of yours, to be at your disposal." "What?" cried Kay, gaping at the three of them. These insignificant, anemic young men, whom he had observed only as a group standing beside the photographs, were actually clerks in the bank, not colleagues of his. That was putting it too strongly, and indicated a gap in the omniscience of the inspector. But they were subordinate employees of the bank, all the same. How could he have failed to notice that? He must have been very much taken up with the inspector and the warders not to recognize these three young men, the stiff Robinsteiner, swinging his arms, the fair Ulick, with the deep-set eyes, and Kaminer, with his insupportable smile, caused by a chronic muscular twitch. "Good morning," said Kay, after a pause, holding out his hand to the three politely bowing figures. "I didn't recognize you. Well, shall we go to our work now, eh?" The young men nodded, smilingly and eagerly, as if they had been waiting all the time merely for this. But when Kay turned to get his hat, which he had left in his room, they all fled, one after the other, to fetch it, which seemed to indicate a certain embarrassment. Kay stood still and watched them through the two open doors. The languid Robinsteiner naturally brought up the rear, for he merely minced along at an elegant trot. Kaminer handed over the hat, and Kay had to tell himself expressly, as indeed he had often to do in the bank, that Kaminer's smile was not intentional, that the man could not smile intentionally if he tried. Then Frau Grubach, who did not appear to be particularly conscious of any guilt, opened the front door to let the whole company out, and Kay glanced down, as so often before, at her apron string, which made such an unreasonably deep cut in her massive body. Down below, he decided his watch in his hand to take a taxi so as to save any further delay in reaching the bank, for he was already half an hour late. must be still coming down the stairs. Kay was annoyed at Kulik for drawing his attention to the man whom he had already identified, indeed, whom he had actually expected to see. "Don't look across," he said hurriedly, without noticing how strange it must seem to speak in that fashion to grown-up men. But no explanation proved necessary, for at that moment the taxi arrived. They took their seats and drove off. Then Kay remembered that he had not noticed the inspector and the warders leaving. The inspector had usurped his attention so that he did not recognize the three clerks, and the clerks in turn had made him oblivious of the inspector. That did not show much presence of mind, and Kay resolved to be more careful in this respect. Yet in spite of himself, he turned round and craned from the back of the car to see if he could perhaps catch sight of the inspector and the warders. But he immediately turned away again and leaned back comfortably in the corner without even having attempted to distinguish one of them. Unlikely as it might seem, this was just the moment when he would have welcomed a few words from his companions, but the others seemed to be suddenly tired. Robinsteiner gazed out to the right, Kulik to the left, and only Kamener faced him with his nervous grin, which unfortunately, on grounds of humanity, could not be made a subject of conversation. That spring, Kay had been accustomed to pass his evenings in this way. After work, whenever possible, he was usually in his office until 9. He would take a short walk alone or with some of his colleagues, and then go to the beer hall, where until 11 he sat at a table, patronized mostly by elderly men. But there were exceptions. as you've spoken so frankly to me. Herr K., I may as well admit to you that I listened for a little behind the door, and that the two warders told me a few things too. It's a matter of your happiness, and I really have that at heart, more perhaps than I should, for I am only your landlady. Well then, I heard a few things, but I can't say that they were particularly bad. No, you are under arrest, certainly, but not as a thief is under arrest. If one's arrested as a thief, that's a bad business. But as for this arrest, it gives me the feeling of something very learned. Forgive me if what I say is stupid. It gives me the feeling of something learned which I don't understand, but which there is no need to understand. What you've just said is by no means stupid, Frau Gruber. At least I'm partly of the same opinion, except that I judge the whole thing still more severely. There's nothing learned about it. It's completely null and void. I was taken by surprise. That was all. If immediately on awakening I had got up without troubling my head about Anna's absence, and had come to you without regarding anyone who tried to bar my way, I could have breakfasted in the kitchen for a change, and could have got you to bring me my clothes from my room. In short, if I had behaved sensibly, nothing further would have happened. All this would have been nipped in the bud. But one is so unprepared. In the bank, for instance, I am always prepared. Nothing of that kind could possibly happen to me there. I have my own attendant. The general telephone and the office telephone stand before me on my desk. People keep coming in to see me, clients and clerks, and above all, my mind is always on my work, and so kept on the alert. It would be an actual pleasure to me if a situation like that cropped up in the bank. Well, it's past history now, and I didn't really intend to speak about it again, only I wanted to hear your judgment, the judgment of a sensible woman, and I am very glad we are in agreement. But now you must give me your hand on it. An agreement such as this must be confirmed with a handshake. Will she take my hand? The inspector wouldn't do it, he thought, gazing at the woman with a critical eye. She stood up, because he had stood up. She was a little embarrassed, for she had not understood all that he had said, and because of her embarrassment, she said something which she had not intended to say, and which was, moreover, rather out of place. Don't take it so much to heart, Herr K., she said with tears in her voice, forgetting naturally to take his hand. I had no idea that I was taking it to heart, said Kay suddenly, tired and seeing how little it mattered whether she agreed with him or not. At the door he asked, "Is Fräulein Burstner in?" "No," replied Frau Grubach, and in giving this dry piece of information, she smiled with honest if belated sympathy. "She's at the theater. Do you want to ask her something? Shall I give her a message?" "Oh, I just wanted a word or two with her. I'm afraid I don't know when she will be back. When she goes to the theater, she's usually late. It's of no consequence," said Kay, turning to the door, his head sunk on his breast. "I only wanted to apologize to her for having borrowed her room today. That's quite unnecessary. Herr K., you are too scrupulous. Fräulein Burstner knows nothing about it. She hasn't been back since early this morning. Everything has been put back in its place again, too. She often comes home late, said Kay, looking at Frau Grubach as if she were to blame for it. Young people are like that, said Frau Grubach, apologetically. Certainly, said Kay, but it can go too far. That it can, said Frau Grubach. How right you are, Herr Kay. In this case, especially, perhaps I have no wish to speak ill of Fräulein Burstner. She is a dear, good girl, kind, decent, punctual, industrious. I admire all these qualities in her, but one thing is undeniable. She should have more pride and should keep herself more herself. She should have more pride, should keep herself more to herself. This is strange. This very month, I have met her twice already, on outlying streets, and each time with a different gentleman. It worries me, and as sure as I stand here, Erke, I haven't told anybody but you, but I'm afraid there's no help for it. I shall have to talk with Fräulein Burstner herself about it. Besides, it isn't the only thing that has made me suspicious of her. You're quite on the wrong track, said Kay, with a sudden fury which he was scarcely able to hide, and you have obviously misunderstood my remark about Fräulein Burstner. It wasn't meant in that way. In fact, I frankly warn you against saying anything to her. You're quite mistaken. I know Fräulein Burstner very well. There is a word of truth in what you say, but perhaps I'm going too far myself. I don't want to interfere. You can say what you like to her. Good night. Good night, Erke, said Frau Grubach, imploringly, hurrying after him to his door, which he had already opened. I don't really mean to say anything to her yet, of course. I'll wait to see what happens before I do anything. You're the only one I've spoken to in confidence. After all, it must be to the interest of all my boarders that I try to keep my house respectable, and that is all I'm anxious about in this case. Respectable, cried Kay, through the chink of the door. If you want to keep your house respectable, you'll have to begin by giving me notice. Then he shut the door and paid no attention to the faint knocking that ensued. On the other hand, as he felt no desire to sleep, he resolved to stay awake and take the opportunity of noting at what hour Fräulein Burstner returned. Perhaps when she did so it might still be possible, unsuitable though the hour was, to have a few words with her. On the other hand, as he felt no desire to sleep, he resolved to stay awake and take the opportunity of noting at what hour Fräulein Burstner returned. Perhaps when she did so it might still be possible, unsuitable though the hour was, to have a few words with her. As he lounged by the window and shut his tired eyes, he actually considered for a moment paying Frau Grubach back by persuading Fräulein Burstner to give notice along with him. Yet he saw at once that this was an excessive reaction, and he began to suspect himself of wishing to change his lodgings because of that morning's events. Nothing could be more senseless, not to say It was a little after 11:30 when he heard somebody on the stairs. Absorbed in his thoughts, he had been marching up and down the entrance hall for some time, as if it were his own room, and now he fled behind his bedroom door. It was Fraulein Berstner coming in. As she locked the front door, she shivered and drew her silk shawl around her slim shoulders. In a minute, she would be going into her room where Kay certainly could not intrude at such an hour. He would therefore have to speak to her now, but unfortunately he had forgotten to switch on the light in his room, so that if he were to emerge from the darkness, it would look as if he were waylaying her, and at least must be somewhat alarming. No time was to be lost. So, in his confusion, he whispered through the chink of the door, "Fraulein Berstner." It sounded like a prayer, not like a summons. "Is anyone there?" asked Fraulein Berstner, looking round with wide-open eyes. "It's I," said Kay, stepping forward. "Oh, Herr Kay," said Fraulein Berstner, smiling. "Good evening," and she held out her hand to him. "I should like to have a word or two with you. Will you allow me to do so now?" "Now?" asked Fraulein Berstner. "Must it be now? A little unusual, isn't it? I've been waiting for you ever since 9. Well, I was at the theater, you know. I had no idea you were waiting. What I want to talk to you about didn't happen till today. Oh well, I have no serious objection, except that I am so tired I can scarcely stand on my feet. So come for a few minutes to my room. We can't possibly talk here. We should waken everybody, and I should dislike that for our own sakes even more than for theirs. Wait here till I have turned on the light in my room, and then you can switch off the light here." Kay did so, but waited until Fraulein Berstner from her room again invited him in. In a is possible, said Fräulein Berstner, very much on the alert. You see, said Kay, you haven't much experience in legal matters. No, I haven't, said Fräulein Berstner, and I have often regretted it, for I would like to know everything there is to know, and law courts interest me particularly. A court of law has a curious attraction, hasn't it? But I'll soon remedy my ignorance in that respect, for next month I am joining the clerical staff of a lawyer's office. That's excellent, said Kay. Then you'll be able to help me a little with my case. That may well be, said Fräulein Berstner. Why not? I like to make good use of my knowledge, but I mean it seriously, said Kay, or at least halfway seriously, as you yourself mean it. The case is too trifling to need a lawyer, but I could do very well with an advisor. Yes, but if I am to be an advisor, I must know what it's all about, said Fräulein Berstner. That's just the trouble, said Kay. I don't know that myself. Then you've simply been making fun of me, said Fräulein Berstner, extravagantly disappointed. It was surely unnecessary to choose this late hour for doing so, and she walked away from the photographs, where they had been standing together for a long time. But Fräulein, said Kay, I'm not making fun of you. Why won't you believe me? I have already told you all I know. In fact, more than I know, for it was not a real court of inquiry. I called it that because I didn't know what else to call it. There was no interrogation at all. I was merely arrested, but it was done by a commission. Fräulein Berstner sat down on the sofa and laughed again. What was it like then? She asked. Horrible, said Kay, but he was no longer thinking of what he was saying, for he was completely taken up in staring at Fräulein Berstner, who was leaning her head on one hand. Her elbow was resting on the sofa cushions, while with the other she slowly caressed her hip. That's too general, she said. What's too general? Asked Kay. Then he came to himself and said, Shall I let you see how it happened? He wanted to move about, and yet he did not want to leave. I'm tired, said Fräulein Berstner. You came home so late, said Kay. So you've gone the length of reproaching me, and I deserve it, too, Berstner turned pale and put her hand to her heart. Kay was violently startled. It took him a moment or so to withdraw his thoughts from the events of the morning and the girl before whom he was acting them. No sooner had he come to himself than he rushed over to Fräulein Berstner and seized her hand. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "I'll put everything right. But who can it be? There's only the living room next door. Nobody sleeps there." "No," Fräulein Berstner whispered in his ear. "Since yesterday, a nephew of Frau Rubach has been sleeping there, a captain. There was no other room he could have. I forgot all about it." "Why did you have to shout like that?" "I'm all upset." "There's no need for that," said Kay, and as she sank back on the cushions, he kissed her on the brow. Away with you," she said, hastily sitting up again. "Do go away. Do go now. What are you thinking about? He's listening at the door. He hears everything. How you torment me." I won't go," said Kay, "until you are a little calmer. Come to the far corner of the room. He can't hear us there." She let herself be led there. "You forget," he said, "that though this is may mean unpleasantness. You forget," he said, "that though this may mean unpleasantness for you, it is not at all serious. You know how Frau Grubach, who has the decisive voice in this matter, particularly as the captain is her nephew, you know how she almost venerates me and believes absolutely everything I say. She is also dependent on me, I may say, for she has borrowed a fair sum of money from me. I shall confirm any explanation of our being together here that you like to invent, if it is in the least practicable, and I pledge myself to make Frau Grubach not only publicly accepted, but also rely and honestly believe it. I shall confirm any explanation of our being together here that you like to invent, if it is in the least practicable, and I pledge myself to make Frau Grubach not only publicly accepted, but also rely and honestly believe it. You needn't consider me at all. If you want to have it announced that I assaulted you, then Frau Grubach will be informed accordingly, and she will believe it without losing her confidence in me. She's so devoted to me." Fräulein Berstner, silent and somewhat limp, stared at the floor. "Why shouldn't Frau Grubach believe that I assaulted you?" Kay added. He was gazing at her hair. It was reddish hair, parted in the middle, and fastened with a bun at the back, and very neatly dressed. He expected her to look up at him, but she said without changing her posture, "Forgive me. I was terrified at the sudden knocking rather than at any consequence of the captain's being there. It was so still after you shouted, and then there came these knocks. That was why I was so terrified. I was sitting quite near the door, too. The knocking seemed to be just beside me. I thank you for your offer, but I'm not going to accept it. I can hear the responsibility for anything that happens in my room, no matter who questions it. I'm surprised you don't see the insult to me that is implied in your suggestion. wrist again. She let him take it this time, and so led him to the door. He was firmly resolved to leave, but at the door he stopped as if he had not expected to find a door there. Fraulein burst. But at the door he stopped as if he had not expected to find a door there. Fraulein Burstner seized this moment to free herself, open the door, and slip into the entrance hall, where she whispered, "Now, please, do come." Look, she pointed to the captain's door, underneath which showed a strip of light. He has turned on his light and is amusing himself at our expense. "I'm just coming," Kay said, rushed out, seized her, and kissed her, first on the lips, then all over the face, like some thirsty animal, lapping greedily at a spring of long-sought fresh water. Finally, he kissed her on the neck, right on the throat, and kept his lips there for a long time. A slight noise from the captain's room made him look up. "I'm going now," he said. He wanted to call Fraulein Burstner by her first name, but he did not know what it was. She nodded, warily, resigned her hand for him to kiss, half turning away, as if she were unaware of what she did, and went into the room with a down-bent head. Shortly afterwards, Kay was in his bed. He fell asleep almost at once, but before doing so, he thought for a little about his behavior. He was pleased with it, yet surprised that he was not